I
You need to
closed the
listen to
only
me now.
bridge into their neighborhood at
trust me.
exactly 5:12 a.m.
I've heard
And by
enough.
6 o'clock,
There's
42
nothing
luxury
more to
SUVs were
discuss.
lined up bumper
Looks
to
strong.
bumper with nowhere
I'll
to
check it
go.
again later.
Engines idling, drivers stepping out in pressed
That'll
golf
do for
shirts
now.
and silk
Let's head to
robes,
the south
staring
pasture.
at a steel gate that hadn't been
Welcome
there
to the
yesterday.
neighborhood.
And the sound of
Everything
that
looks up
chain
to
pulling
code.
tight still echoed in my ears like a decision finally made. The morning air smelled like cold metal and river fog, and somewhere behind me, water moved slow and steady. Under that old wooden span my grandfather built in 1968, back when this land was nothing but cattle, mesquite,
All
and a
right, you're
dirt
all
road
set.
that didn't
Thanks
show
so
up
much.
on
Take
any
care.
county map. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I own 2,400 acres of land just outside what people now call Willow Creek Estates, though when I was a kid, it was just open range and a creek that flooded every spring. The kind of place you learn patience before you ever learn power. I didn't say a word as the first homeowner walked up to the gate, phone already in hand, voice sharp, demanding access like it had always been theirs. And I just watched, boots planted in gravel that crunched under every small shift of weight. Because what they didn't understand, what none of them understood yet, was that every inch of pavement they drove on, every manicured lawn they watered, every mailbox lined up in perfect suburban symmetry depended on one thing. And that thing was sitting right behind me, locked, chained, and very much not public. See, a year ago, this place looked different before the stone entrance signs, before the private community banners, before Victoria Hargrove started hosting weekend tours in heels sharp enough to stab the ground and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, selling people the dream of exclusivity while standing on land she didn't fully control. I remember the first time she drove out here. White SUV kicking dust across my fence line, talking about future access integration. Like it was already decided, like ownership was just a suggestion, and I let her talk. Because sometimes the fastest way to understand someone is to let them believe they've already won. The bridge didn't look like much back then, just weathered planks, iron bolts dark with age, the kind of structure people assume belongs to everyone because it's always been there, because it connects things, because it's convenient, and convenience has a way of rewriting memory. But I knew every inch of it, knew the original survey lines, the handwritten deed filed before the county even paved the main road, knew exactly where my property started and where everyone else's assumptions began, and I kept that knowledge. Quiet, like a tool you don't show until you need it. So I watched as Willow Creek Estates rose up piece by piece, concrete poured, fences built, roads stretched out like veins all leading to one narrow crossing over slow-moving water, and every truck, every delivery, every future homeowner rolled across that bridge without asking, without checking, without ever wondering who actually owned it. And now, standing there with the chain locked and the key cold in my hand, I could hear the shift happening, the moment confusion turns into realization, because power doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself when access disappears. And as Victoria's voice cut through the morning, sharp and controlled, but just a little too loud, I finally spoke for the first time, calm, steady, and impossible to ignore, and all I said was, "That bridge isn't part of your community. It never was." I did not raise my voice, did not step forward, did not even unlock my stance on that gravel path as Victoria walked toward me, heels clicking sharp against the wood planks like she still believed sound alone carried authority, her perfume cutting through the cool river air with something too sweet, too controlled, like everything else about her. And behind her the line of cars stretched longer now, engines humming, doors slamming, people checking their phones, the quiet panic of inconvenience, turning into something heavier, something closer to doubt. I could feel it in the way their eyes moved from her to me, from the gate to the bridge, from confidence to calculation. Victoria stopped just short of the chain, her smile still there, but thinner now, stretched tight like it had a limit, and she said my name like we were still in a negotiation I had already walked away from. "Ethan, this is not how community access works." And I let that hang in the air for a second, the word community bouncing off steel and water like it belonged somewhere else. I glanced down at the old bolts along the bridge rail, dark with rust but still solid, still exactly where my grandfather placed them more than 50 years ago, each one driven in by hand, measured twice, set once, the kind of work that does not ask permission to last. When I looked back up, I could see the first crack in her control, not loud, not dramatic, just a hesitation in her breathing, the way her fingers tightened around her phone like she was already searching for a number that could fix this. You built a road, I said, voice steady, low, the kind of tone that does not need volume to carry. But you never built access. And that was when the murmurs started behind her, soft at first, then growing, neighbors asking each other questions they should have asked months ago, voices layered with confusion, frustration, the beginning of something unraveling. I could smell exhaust mixing with river damp and freshly cut grass from their side. That artificial perfection pressing up against something older, something real, and for the first time, they were noticing the difference. Victoria turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the noise behind her, and I saw it then. The calculation shifting, her mind moving through options, through legal angles, through control points that suddenly were not hers anymore. We have easement rights, she said, quicker now, sharper, like speed could replace certainty, and I shook my head once, slow, deliberate, not dismissive, just final, because I had already read every page she had not, already traced every line she assumed did not matter. No, I said, and even the river seemed to quiet under that word. You assumed you did. And that was when one of the homeowners stepped forward, a man in a pressed blue shirt still holding his coffee cup like the morning had not fully caught up with him. And he asked the question out loud that everyone else was thinking. Then how do we get out? And I let that sit for a moment, let the weight of it settle into the wood, the metal, the water, into the realization that access is not just convenience, it is dependency, and dependency, when misunderstood, becomes leverage. I shifted the key in my hand, the metal cool against my palm, and looked back at Victoria, not angry, not satisfied, just clear, because clarity is the part most people avoid until they cannot anymore. And I said, that depends on who owns the way out. The silence that followed that question stretched longer than it should have, broken only by the low hum of engines and the steady creak of wood settling under its own weight. And I could see it happening in real time. The moment when assumption finally gives way to reality, when people realize that what they believed was permanent was actually conditional all along. Victoria did not answer the man, not right away. And that told me everything I needed to know, because if she had something solid, something written, something real, she would have used it already, loud and fast and certain. But instead she stood there, eyes flicking toward the bridge like she was seeing it for the first time, not as an extension of her neighborhood, but as a boundary she never actually crossed on paper. I shifted my weight slightly, gravel crunching under my boots. That familiar sound grounding me the same way it had when I was 10 years old walking fence lines with my grandfather, learning where things began and where they ended, not by guesswork, but by markers, by records, by lines drawn long before anyone decided to ignore them. This bridge was built in 1968, I said, not raising my voice, just letting the words carry across the water and the waiting cars. And every board, every bolt, every inch of it sits inside my property line. And I watched as a few of the homeowners turned, looking back down the road they came from as if expecting to find another way they had somehow missed. But there was none, just that single strip of asphalt leading to a single crossing, designed for convenience, sold as certainty, but never secured as either. Victoria stepped closer to the chain, not touching it, but close enough that the tension in her shoulders showed. Her composure still there but thinner now, stretched over something that was starting to fracture, and she said, "We have been using this access for over a year. Like time itself could rewrite ownership, like repetition could replace permission," and I nodded once, because she was not wrong about the usage, just about what it meant. "You have been using it," I said, "but you were never granted the right to." And that difference settled into the group like a weight, subtle but undeniable, because deep down, everyone understands the difference between what they do and what they are allowed to do. They just hope it never gets challenged. A breeze moved through the trees along the creek, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and something older than any of the houses behind her, and for a second, all that polished development felt out of place, like it had been set down without fully belonging. One of the drivers turned off his engine, then another, the quiet spreading outward in small, reluctant steps. And in that quiet, you could hear it clearly, the absence of an alternative, the absence of a second road, a second bridge, a second option. Victoria finally pulled out her phone, fingers moving faster now, dialing, searching, reaching for someone who could tell her this was fixable, that there was a clause, a document, something that turned assumption into fact. But even before she spoke, I knew what she was not going to find, because I had already looked, already traced the records back through county filings, survey maps, handwritten deeds stored in climate-controlled rooms that smell like paper and time. Call whoever you need to call, I said, calm, steady, not challenging, just stating what was already true. But ask them one question, and she paused, just for a fraction of a second, like part of her already knew the answer, and I finished. Ask them who owns the structure you are standing in front of. And as she turned slightly away to speak into the phone, her voice lower now, more controlled, I could see it settling in across the line of people behind her, the realization that access is not something you assume into existence. It is something someone grants, and right now, that someone was standing on the other side of a locked chain holding the only way in or out. Victoria's voice dropped lower as she turned away from me, one hand pressed against her ear, pacing just enough to keep control of the conversation she was now clearly losing, and I could hear fragments of it carried across the still morning air. Legal terms, property access, easement rights, words that sounded strong when spoken quickly but felt thinner the longer they hung, without confirmation. The people behind her had stopped pretending this was a small inconvenience. Phones were out now. Some calling workplaces, some texting, some just standing there staring at the locked chain like it might explain itself if they looked long enough. And the smell of warm engine oil mixed with river damp and fresh-cut landscaping from their side of the bridge, a strange collision of new and old that made everything feel slightly off balance. I leaned one hand against the wooden railing, feeling the rough grain under my palm, the same texture I remembered from summers spent sanding splinters and replacing boards alongside my grandfather, who used to say that anything worth building had to be strong enough to stand alone, not just when it was convenient, but when it was tested. Victoria turned back toward me, phone still in her hand, and this time there was no smile, just a controlled tightness in her expression, like someone trying to keep a door closed that was already starting to swing open. Our attorney says this is a shared access point, she said, each word placed carefully, deliberately, like she was rebuilding ground she had already lost, and I nodded slightly, not dismissing it, just recognizing the pattern, because I had heard that same argument weeks ago when the first survey markers disappeared and the asphalt crew rolled through without so much as a knock on my gate. Did your attorney see the original deed? I asked, calm, steady, not confrontational, just precise. And the way her eyes paused for half a second told me everything I needed to know before she even answered, because hesitation has a sound to it even when no words follow. The creek moved quietly beneath us, water slipping past rock and shadow with that slow, constant rhythm that does not care about paperwork or perception. And for a moment, I let that sound fill the space between us, because sometimes silence does more work than any argument. We have county approval for the road, she said, shifting direction now, trying to anchor the conversation somewhere official, somewhere documented, and I let out a slow breath, tasting the cool air as it settled, because this was the part where assumption usually hides behind authority. For the road, I said, letting the distinction sit there clearly, not for the crossing. And that difference landed harder this time. You could see it ripple through the group behind her, people looking down at the pavement under their feet like it suddenly stopped short of something they had never questioned before. One man stepped back toward his vehicle, shaking his head slightly. Another leaned against his door with his arms crossed, the confidence that came with buying into a finished story now cracking under the realization that part of that story had been skipped. Victoria glanced down at the chain, then back at me, and for the first time since she arrived, there was something honest in her expression, not fear exactly, but the recognition that control is not something you declare. It is something you verify, and she had not verified this. I reached into my back pocket slowly and pulled out a folded document, the paper worn at the edges but still firm, the kind of thing that has been handled enough to matter, and I held it up just enough for her to see without stepping forward. Recorded in Travis County, 1968. I said, my voice even, measured, structure ownership, exclusive, no public easement granted, and the words were not loud, but they carried Because truth has a way of settling into people whether they want it to or not. Behind her, someone muttered something under their breath. Another voice asked what that meant, and I could feel the shift completing itself, the moment when this stopped being a debate and started becoming a fact they had to live with. And as Victoria looked at the paper, then back at the bridge, then finally at me, I knew she understood it now, not as an argument to win, but as a boundary she had already crossed without permission. The moment the word exclusive settled into the air, everything shifted from confusion into consequence. And you could see it in the way people stopped talking over each other and started listening, really listening, because this was no longer about inconvenience. This was about access they had already built their lives around. Victoria's grip tightened around her phone, her thumb hovering like she was deciding whether to call someone else or hang up entirely. And for a second, just a second, the control she carried like armor slipped enough for reality to show through. That document does not override community development rights, she said. But the words came slower now, less certain, like she was repeating something she had been told instead of something she fully understood. And I let a small pause sit between us, not to challenge her, but to give her space to hear what she had just said. The creek moved steadily below, the soft rush of water against stone filling the gap, and I could smell the faint metallic tang of the chain warming in the early sun. That quiet, physical reminder that this was not theoretical, this was already in place. It does not have to override anything, I said, my voice level, almost conversational. Because your development never included it, and that landed differently, not like an argument, but like a correction, simple and precise. A woman near the front of the line stepped closer, her keys still in her hand, her voice edged with something between frustration and disbelief. So what are we supposed to do? Just sit here. And I looked at her, not unkindly, just honestly, because she was asking the right question, just too late. That depends on how your access was represented when you bought in, I said, and I saw the realization hit her before she even responded, the memory of contracts, brochures, guided tours that never mentioned ownership of a crossing, only the convenience of one. Victoria turned sharply toward the group, trying to pull their attention back, trying to reassert control before it slipped too far. But the current had already shifted, because once people start asking their own questions, they stop waiting for someone else to answer them. I unfolded the document fully now, letting the morning light catch the ink and the stamped seal, not for show, just for clarity, and held it where anyone close enough could see that it was not new, not reactive, not something created overnight, but something that had existed long before their neighborhood ever broke ground. There is no recorded easement, I said, steady, deliberate. Not in your filings, not in mine, not in any county record tied to this structure. And the words moved through the group like a slow wave, quiet but undeniable, because records do not care about expectations, they care about what is written and what is not. A man further back let out a short breath, shaking his head, and another voice asked whether that meant emergency services could not get through, and that question hung heavier than the others, because now the stakes were becoming visible, not dramatic, just real. Victoria stepped forward again, closer this time, close enough that the space between us felt intentional, measured, and she lowered her voice just enough that it carried only to me. You are creating a liability issue, she said, and there it was. The shift from authority to negotiation, from assumption to consequence, and I met her gaze without moving, because this was the part she had not planned for, the part where control changes hands not with force, but with documentation. No, I said quietly. I am revealing one. And as the words settled between us, I could hear it again. The absence of engines now as more drivers turned their vehicles off. The stillness spreading, not peaceful, but certain. Because when access disappears, so does the illusion that it was ever guaranteed. Victoria did not respond right away, and that silence said more than anything she could have argued. Because when someone used to control runs out of certainty, they start measuring every word instead of delivering it, and I could see her recalculating, not just the situation in front of her, but everything that led up to it, every decision that assumed this bridge was part of her domain. The sun had climbed just enough to warm the top rail under my hand, the wood dry and solid, and the chain cast a sharp shadow across the planks like a line no one had bothered to notice until it was too late. Behind her, a man in a gray jacket stepped forward, his voice steady but edged with something more grounded than frustration. "We closed on our house 3 months ago, and they told us this was the only access road." And he did not look at Victoria when he said it. He looked at me, like he already understood where the answer actually lived. I nodded once, slow, not dismissing him, just acknowledging the truth of what he had been told. "They told you how to get in," I said, "not who allowed it." And that distinction landed harder this time, because it did not challenge his experience, it reframed it. A woman near him shook her head, whispering something about disclosures and paperwork, and another voice asked if this meant their property value was affected. And there it was, the shift from inconvenience to consequence becoming visible in real time, not dramatic, just practical, the kind of realization that does not fade once it sets in. Victoria straightened slightly, pulling herself back into position, but the tone had changed now, less command, more containment. "This can be resolved through proper channels," she said, louder this time so the group could hear, trying to gather their attention back under her voice. And I let that hang for a second before answering, because she was not wrong, just late. "It already is being resolved," I said, calm, measured. "You are just seeing the part that was always there." And I tapped the top of the railing lightly, the sound dull but solid, a small physical reminder that this was not new, not reactive, not something created this morning. The creek continued its steady movement below, unchanged by any of this, and the smell of damp earth rose slightly as the sun pulled moisture from the ground, grounding everything in something older than contracts and meetings. Victoria glanced back at the line of homeowners, then at the gate, then at me, and for the first time, her next question was not a statement disguised as authority. It was direct, controlled, and unmistakably real. "What do you want?" And that question settled differently than all the others, because it acknowledged something she had avoided until now, that this was not about stopping me, it was about needing me. I let a small pause sit there, not for effect, but because timing matters when the ground shifts, and I looked past her for a moment at the stretch of road that led into her development, smooth, clean, carefully built, all of it dependent on a single crossing that had never been part of their control. "I want the record to match reality," I said finally, voice steady, not raised, not aggressive, just clear. And right now, it does not. And I could see it land, not just with her, but with the people behind her, because it was not a demand for something new. It was a correction of something that had been overlooked. A breeze moved through again, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and something synthetic from their side, contrasting with the natural dampness around the creek. And in that contrast, everything about this situation became sharper, clearer, more defined. Victoria took a slow breath, her posture adjusting slightly, not collapsing, not conceding, but shifting into something more precise, something that understood the weight of what had already been revealed. And as she looked back at me, the space between us no longer felt like a standoff. It felt like a line that had finally been seen for what it always was. The air felt different after that, heavier in a quiet, measured way, like everything had settled into place whether anyone liked it or not. And for the first time since the cars lined up behind her, nobody was pretending this was temporary. Victoria held my gaze a second longer, then glanced past me toward the far side of the bridge, toward land that stretched out without fences, without signs, without anything that needed to announce ownership because it had never been questioned until now. And when she looked back, there was something sharper in her eyes, not defiance, not quite, but recognition, the kind that comes when you realize the leverage is not where you thought it was. "Then we correct it," she said, her voice controlled again, steadier now that she had shifted from denial to strategy, and I nodded once, because that was the first accurate thing she had said all morning. Behind her, conversations had turned quieter, more focused, people no longer asking what was happening but what it meant, the difference between curiosity and consequence settling in like the sun climbing higher over the tree line. I could hear a car door close, then another, engines now silent across the line, and the absence of that noise made every word carry farther, clearer, like the situation itself had stripped away everything unnecessary. "Correction takes agreement," I said, resting my hand lightly against the chain. the metal warm now, steady. An agreement starts with acknowledgment, and I watched that land, not just with her, but with the group behind her, because acknowledgement is the part most people try to skip, the part where you admit something was built on an assumption instead of a right. A man in a tan jacket stepped forward slightly, not fully crossing the line, but close enough to be heard. "Are you saying we cannot legally use this at all?" And his voice was calm, but there was weight behind it. The kind that comes from understanding that the answer might change more than just his morning. I looked at him directly, because he deserved a clear answer. "I am saying you have been using it without a recorded right to do so," I said, steady, precise. "And that matters now because it has been challenged." And that distinction settled into the group like a line drawn in real time, not aggressive, just defined. Victoria exhaled slowly, her shoulders shifting as she adjusted her stance, no longer trying to dominate the space but to work within it. And she stepped half a pace closer, careful, measured, like someone approaching something they finally understood had boundaries. "What does acknowledgement look like to you?" she asked, and that question carried differently than anything she had said before, because it was not about proving me wrong. It was about finding a way forward that included what had already been established. I glanced down at the bridge again, at the grain of the wood, the small imperfections that come from years of weather and use, none of it hidden, none of it pretending to be something it was not, and then back at her, because the answer was simple, just not easy. "It looks like updating every document tied to your development," I said, "to reflect that this crossing is privately owned and access is granted, not assumed." And I let that sit there, not pushing it, just stating it, because the truth does not need force when it is already holding the structure together. Behind her, someone muttered about contracts, another about disclosures, and the ripple continued outward, not chaotic, just undeniable, like something finally aligning with what had always been there. Victoria nodded once, slow, deliberate, and for the first time, there was no performance in it, just calculation grounded in reality. And as she looked back at me, I could see it clearly. The moment she stopped trying to control the situation and started trying to survive it on terms that were no longer hers to set. By the time Victoria gave that small, controlled nod, the situation had already crossed a line no meeting or memo could reverse. And you could feel it in the way the group behind her stopped looking at her for direction and started looking at each other, quietly recalculating what they had bought into, what they had signed, and more importantly, what had never been written down at all. The sun had risen higher now, warming the asphalt behind them, and I could smell the faint sharpness of heated pavement mixing with the damp, steady scent of the creek below, two environments meeting at a boundary that had always existed but had never been enforced. Victoria stepped slightly to the side, no longer standing directly between me and the others, and that small shift changed everything. Because leadership is not just about speaking, it is about where you stand when things stop going your way. "If access is granted," she said, choosing each word carefully now, "then it can also be formalized." And I watched her as she spoke, not for the words themselves, but for the intent behind them, because this was no longer about control, it was about damage containment. I let a breath out slowly, feeling the morning settle into something calmer, not resolved, but defined, and I nodded once, because she was finally speaking in terms that matched reality. "It can," I said, "but not retroactively, and not without terms." And that word hung there heavier than the others. Because terms imply negotiation, and negotiation implies that what was once taken for granted now has a cost. A man near the front shifted his stance, arms crossing as he looked from the chain to Victoria, then back to me. And you could see it in his expression, not anger, but awareness, the kind that comes when convenience turns into dependency in a way no one planned for. "What kind of terms?" he asked, and his voice carried clearly across the still air, because now everyone wanted to hear the answer, not as a possibility, but as a condition. I rested my hand lightly on the chain again, the metal steady, unyielding, a physical reminder of what this conversation was actually about. And I did not rush the answer, because timing matters when people are finally ready to listen. "Recorded easement," I said, clearly defined, legally binding, with maintenance responsibility and usage limitations spelled out. And I let each part land on its own, not complicated, just complete, because Anything less would only recreate the same problem later under a different name. Victoria's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition of what that meant: the paperwork, the legal review, the admission that their development had moved forward without securing something this fundamental, and I could almost see the chain of meetings already forming in her mind. The calls, the explanations, the careful language she would have to use to reframe what had just happened. Behind her, someone muttered about legal fees, another about timelines, and the ripple of realization continued outward, steady, unavoidable, because once structure meets truth, there is no going back to assumption. And until then, Victoria said, her voice lower now, more measured than before, you intend to keep this closed. And there was no challenge in it, just confirmation, the final piece of understanding settling into place. I met her gaze without moving, the space between us no longer tense, just clear, and I nodded once, slow and certain, because this part did not need explanation. The creek moved steadily beneath us, unchanged, the same way it had for decades, and the bridge stood exactly where it always had, not new, not altered, just finally recognized for what it was. And as the quiet spread across the line of people behind her, I could feel it fully settle, the moment when inconvenience becomes reality, and reality, once acknowledged, does not negotiate its own existence. The decision did not need to be announced. It had already been made the moment the chain went up, and no one could explain why it should come down. And now everything that followed was just people catching up to something that had been true long before any of them arrived. Victoria stood still for a second longer, then gave a short nod, not to me, but to herself, like she had reached the end of an internal calculation and did not like the result, but could not deny it either. And she turned back, toward the line of homeowners, her posture adjusting again, not as sharp as before, but still composed, still controlled in a different way. The way someone speaks when the message matters more than the image. We will be coordinating with legal and county officials, she said, voice steady, projecting just enough to carry across the quiet line. And updates will be provided as we formalize access agreements. And the words were careful, neutral, structured, but the meaning underneath them was clear. This was no longer optional. This was required. Behind her, people listened without interrupting, some nodding slowly, others looking down at their phones, already moving into the next phase, calls to agents, to lenders, to anyone who might explain what this meant for them now. Because the moment had shifted from confusion into consequence, and consequence does not wait for comfort. I stepped back half-a pace, the gravel crunching under my boots, not retreating, just giving the scene the space it needed to settle. And I reached for the lock, the metal warm now under the sun, the key sliding in with a clean, simple motion that felt final in a way words never could. The chain loosened slightly as I turned it, not removed, not opened, just adjusted enough to signal that this was no longer a standoff. It was a structure, something that would now operate on terms instead of assumptions. A few heads lifted at that small movement. Not relief exactly, but recognition, because even a slight shift in access changes how people understand control. Victoria watched the motion carefully, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging what had just happened without needing to say it out loud. The creek moved beneath us the same as it always had, steady, indifferent, carrying the quiet sound of water over stone that had been here long before. Any of this, and would be here long after. And I rested my hand once more on the railing, feeling the grain, the history in it, the weight of something built to last without needing permission to do so. The line of vehicles began to shift slowly, not leaving, not yet, but repositioning, engines starting again one by one, not with urgency, but with acceptance, because now they understood that movement depended on agreement. And agreement had terms. Victoria turned back toward me one last time, her voice lower now, not for the group, just for the space between us. We will be in touch, she said, and there was no edge to it, no performance, just a statement of process, and I nodded once, because that was how this would move forward now, not through assumption, but through record, through definition, through clarity. As she stepped away and the distance between us widened, the bridge behind me felt exactly the same as it always had. Solid, quiet, certain, but everything around it had Changed, not because the structure moved, but because people finally saw it for what it was, not a convenience, not a shared path, but a boundary with an owner. And as the morning settled into its next phase, one thing was clear in a way it had never needed to be before: access was never free. It was just never questioned until someone decided to close the gate.